there are a lot of things that need to be in place for private sector to invest. And maybe the most important thing of all is to have a policy certainty. How do we get these technologies to emerging and developing countries? And here I think China can both teach some lessons how you can cleverly adapt and imitate and then eventually become an innovator, a genuine innovator too. But also maybe can be part of helping to transfer these technologies to developed countries.
Hello everyone, welcome to SFC Markets Finance. In the past several months, some extreme weather events took place throughout the world. Will these events be a new normal? At the same time, energy crisis spread across Europe. Should all countries finish green transition as soon as possible? How can we achieve net zero? Let's welcome Erik Berglof, Chief Economist of the AIIB, to join our discussion. Hello Erik, thanks for joining us. Let's begin with climate change. How much are extreme weather events costing the economy?
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, it's clear that it has a very significant economic impact, and a lot of studies have looked at this. And over the past 50 years, several trillions around the world have been lost to climate change, and it differs a lot from different parts of the world. But clearly, the developing countries have lost a lot more relative to the size of their economies. Most of this is to storms and to some extent floods, but again, that differs across different countries in the world.
Will extreme weather events be a new normal? If do, how can we avoid huge economic costs?
Well, obviously, we all have to contribute. That's the thing about climate change, is that it's one of those things where everybody's contribution matters. So what you do in China, what we do in Europe, what people do in the US, every contribution matters. So when we reduce our carbon footprint or our emissions of carbon dioxide, that helps for the world as a whole. So we need to look at every aspect of economic activity. Everything we do needs to be rethought, and that's what's going on in most parts of the world.
We all know climate change is the main cause for extreme weather events. What challenges do we face while dealing with climate change?
Well, of course, there are numerous challenges. One is, of course, that we have become very dependent on fossil fuels, and fossil fuels have a lot of advantages, that they are, more reliable, they are relatively easily accessible. We have established a lot of infrastructure and so on to explore and extract and use fossil fuels. So we have to change that, and that's going to take some time. And of course, we have also adjusted our behavior to fit with a particular type of energy production, typical type of transportation. All those things we need to think through. So that takes time, and we need a lot of different instruments. We need better prices that reflect the real costs of different forms of energy. We need to have deeper involvement of government in many aspects to make sure that the transformation happens as quickly as is needed, and so on. We need the private sector to contribute, and we need to find ways of engaging with the private sector. So.
What will the AIIB do on addressing climate change?
Climate change or climate mitigation, and I haven't mentioned climate adaptation, which is also very important. But and climate adaptation is about making sure that the impact of climate change is less for individual citizens and so on. But and that is even in a way even a greater challenge, because it's not so easy to get funding for that, and then so all those things we need to work on, both climate mitigation, so reducing CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, but also to build more resilient and adapt our more resilient societies and adapt ourselves to the changing climate. But so we need to work across almost all aspects of society and certainly all aspects of infrastructure. So we need to work on renewables. We need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to and also make fossil fuels more efficient in their usage. We need to, as I said, we need to work on renewables. We need to work on transportation systems that become greener. So electric vehicles, electric vehicles not only for transportation of people, but also for transportation of goods and so on, and maybe shifting some from road traffic to railways and so on. Probably we need to over time work on how to foster a transformation of air traffic and so on. So there are so many different aspects. Of course, the digital infrastructure, which is something that the AIIB is really keen to be part of. That is going to be a very important part of this transformation, because that's the way we become more efficient, is by introducing more digital infrastructure into more traditional infrastructure. So there are very many things that we can do, and we have an objective of having 50% climate finance. So half of everything we do will be climate finance by 2025. So that's a very ambitious objectives, and we are on track to achieve that. And so that's you could say that's our most ambitious goal, because we have a few other objectives that are part of our strategic plan. But this is the one that comes closest in time, and the one that we are now very much focused on.
Many Asian developing countries have declared their carbon-neutral climate ambitions. However, there remains the double gap of technology and finance to make green transition. How can these countries bridge the gaps?
Yeah, so I think one should be careful in putting these two things in contradiction. Clearly, there will be some costs associated with the transformation to net zero, but a lot of jobs will be created also in this process. So, and a lot of good jobs, a lot of very qualified jobs in the process of installing and managing renewables, for example. There will be a lot of focus on green innovation and innovation, not only just developing completely new forms of green technology, but also in adapting and imitating it in emerging and developing countries. So I think this is, yes, there will be some costs, and we need to help emerging and developing countries in that journey, and there's a commitment from advanced economies to do so, and we need to make sure that this is delivered on, and we have talked about 100 billion per year, and I think that is probably not enough, but we need at least to achieve that, and that is what the focus should be on now. Make sure that we help emerging developing countries in that transformation. Of course, about finance, but it's also making sure that technologies are freely available, and we make sure that there's no restrictions on the transfer of these technologies and so on. All that is very critically important as we try to bring the world to net zero.
Besides the government efforts and the global cooperation, do you think the private sector should invest more in green transition? Why? Yeah,
so of course, so this is a huge and I would argue the largest challenge for the state and for state capacity worldwide, and particularly, of course, in emerging and developing countries where the state capacity sometimes is or very often is not sufficient. But of course, it cannot be achieved without the private sector, and the private sector has a lot to contribute. Of course, we think, of the capital, the very large amount of capital that is going through the international financial system, and we need to see to it that we make it possible for that capital to come to finance green infrastructure and green transformation in emerging and developing countries too. But it's not just about capital. It's also about skills. A lot of skills in this space in the private sector. It's about the energy, the dynamism that comes from the transformation that's going on in the private sector constantly, through innovation and so on. And that's very much needed. And we can see in some countries, for example, in India, where the renewable industry has completely been undertaken by the private sector. So, I'm not saying that's the only way it can be done. China has shown that it can be done in other ways too. But I think it is clearly possible to engage with the private sector, and the private sector give the private sector incentives to come into this part of the transformation. So, state capacity, we need to expand it. And actually, one thing that I should emphasize is that the private sector can be very useful in helping to build state capacity. So by contracting between the state and the private sector, the state can learn. And we have a lot of examples of that through so-called public-private partnerships. Partly in China you see that, but also I think more globally you see it very strongly how states, by working with the private sector, have learned how to operate complex infrastructure projects. And that's going to be needed very much now as we move towards net zero.
What will private sector benefit from investments in green transition?
Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of returns to be made. We have had a really spectacular development of renewables. Where we've seen a dramatic fall in the cost of producing energy. So it is now already much cheaper than many fossil fuel based energy. So that those benefits can attract the private sector on their own strength, but also we need to provide incentives for them to go in, and we need to provide also the coordination that they often cannot achieve on their own. So, for example, if you take the electric vehicle industry, you need to have a lot of things in place for private investors to come in. You need to have charging stations. You need to have probably some price guarantees on renewable energy and so on. There are a lot of things that need to be in place for the private sector to invest. And maybe the most important thing of all is to have a policy certainty. The greatest risk in infrastructure in general, but probably here in particular, is that we need to have certainty around all the rules around investing. So things like, for example, feed-in tariffs is the way to stimulate investment in the renewable sector. Those need to be stable over time, and we have seen in many countries around the world where you have them from the beginning, and then it gets politically a little bit embarrassing that these private sector firms are earning some money from this, and then they are withdrawn. Probably better to look at how you can design them from the beginning. Often it's really about just making sure that the uncertainty is removed. What the private sector doesn't like is uncertainty. They want the rules in place, and often once the rules are in place, they can learn how to operate under them. But it's when the rules keep on changing, that's what really deters private sector from coming in.
How will the AIIB help Asian developing countries to finish green transition?
Well, so I already said something about this. So we work across the board. We are. I would be happy to provide with some very concrete examples. I mean, we do renewables in many countries across Asia. So both solar and wind farms and so on. We work on electric vehicles in many countries, including China and India. We We do data centers, many different parts of Asia. Data centers are, of course, important for, as I said before, to the digital architecture, but they're also in themselves very energy consuming. So you need to make investments in the right type of energy source and energy production or the right energy technology. So that is something that we really put a lot of effort in to make sure that when we are working with our sponsors or our partners, that these are taken care of. So this is, as I said, 50% of our investments should be climate finance by 2025. So that's a very ambitious goal. I think there's no other MDB that has a more ambitious goal than that. This is very important for us. And what we have a big advantage is that we can work both with the state sector and with the private sector. And in many cases, as I said, you need to do both. And even sometimes within a single project, both sides need to be involved. So that is a big advantage for AIIB.
According to your research, is there an irreconcilable contradiction among energy transition, net zero goals, and economic recovery in the short term?
So I think one should not overemphasize that. I think there are a lot of ways in which one can make the recovery green or at least greener to really use this opportunity now of making investments to help the economy recover and make them in parts of the economy that really needs to become greener and use greener technology when you make investments now. So again, there will be costs associated with this, but let's make use of this opportunity now to make the necessary investment. What is absolutely key, though, is that these may be slightly more costly technologies that we put in place now. In many cases, as I said, they're already cheaper, but paying a little bit extra for some additional features that gives you, better climate performance or lower emissions of carbon or greenhouse gases, that buys you a lot in the future, because many of these investments will be in place for decades, and it's very important now, since there's so much investments going on and expected over the next decade. It's important that we get the right technologies in place, or at least technologies that are flexible enough to adjust for new green innovation, because green innovation is going on everywhere in the world, and it's really encouraging to see how much is happening, and we have seen what's happening in renewables, but it's happening in so many parts. It's happening in agricultural, it's happening in the fuel and in the fossil fuel sector itself. There's also a lot of innovation going on. So, even as we phase it out, they will become more efficient as we phase them out. So there's a lot of things that we can learn and draw comfort from and make use of when we recover across Asia and the rest of the world.
Do you think we are on the right way to green recovery?
I do think we are on the right way, but we are not there at the speed that we need, and we know that we are, going. We have been able to reduce probably the climate impact by maybe 1 or 2 degrees by 2050, but we need to probably get 1 further degree down, and the difference between 1 degree down is very large, maybe in the order of 10% of GDP, and so it's a very large impact, and it's much larger, that impact in poorer, less developed countries, and it's much larger in South Asia, Southeast Asia than in most other parts of the world. So it is critical that we speed up this process and that we really try to achieve that 1.5 degree that we was sort of the higher aspiration from Paris. And I think we have the technologies, we have I think we also have the institutions, but we just need to use them more purposefully. And I think many of the institutions, like AIIB, climate wasn't the main reason why AIIB was established, but we have sort of been repurposed, or we are repurposing ourselves, and I think that's what we have to see with many other institutions and everywhere in the world, and that is the future. We need to think about every institution in the state and in the private sector. How can we all contribute? And as I said from the very beginning, everybody's contribution matters.
Is there a global effort to reach net zero?
Yes, so I think there is a global effort, and it differs, of course, across different countries. But even the United States, where I think the most important doubts we had, there was some progress now with the latest package that was adopted by the U.S. Congress. And of course, it wasn't the best possible package, and it was smaller than what President Biden originally put on the table. But it's a step forward, and we shouldn't forget that a lot is happening, at the level of individual states. A lot is happening in the private sector in the U.S., in individual cities, and so on. So things are really moving, and a lot of green innovation is actually happening in the U.S. So I think that's something that we should take some comfort from. Europe is, of course, facing challenges now because of the sudden increase in energy prices, and that. But as I said earlier, we have seen some rapid steps forward, and with the interconnection of individual energy system, electrical power systems in Europe, and that's going to be very important. The challenges we are facing now is of course that Europe has many different energy systems and also different degree of dependence on Russian oil and gas, and those countries most dependent will have, of course, most to lose from what's I think is about to happen, a more complete break with energy supplies from Russia. So that's going to be difficult to deal with. But the International Energy Agency has actually done some very interesting work showing that actually the sacrifices that we would have to take in the first few years of adjustment, because I think everyone agrees that in a couple of years this will not be a big issue to redirect our energy supplies or where we get our energy from. But the first few years there will be some difficulties. But what I think the IEA has shown is that there's relatively modest sacrifices that are needed from both from consumers, but also from the corporate sector, in order to make that happen. So again, one shouldn't minimize these effects, but I think there is. It could actually mean that we will get an even faster journey to net zero.
What role will China play in our race to net zero?
So I think China, of course, now is the world's largest emitter of CO2 and greenhouse gases. So China is extremely important. I had the pleasure of leading an international collaboration, international and Chinese collaboration on looking at China's net zero transition. And I think there's no question that there is a genuine commitment from the Chinese leadership to the net zero goals. And there are a lot of things to say about how that should be done, and what already I think a lot has been done. There are also some very difficult trade-offs in the short term. There's so much reliance on, particularly on coal, and of course now, given what's happening with the drought and the challenges for hydropower and so on, there will be many difficulties in the short run. But I think what is very important is to keep the long run target in mind all the time, and that we cannot let this other target, the carbon peak target for 2030, we cannot let that slip. And if anything, we would like to reach it earlier, and the higher that is, the higher the peak is, the more problems we will have later. So I think the commitment is there, but there are also big challenges, and the understanding that you need to have these two targets, not only at the national level, you need to have it at the provincial level, you need to have it in individual cities and in every sector. So it's something that really needs to involve everybody in the government and in across all the ministries and in the private sector, and of course in state-owned enterprises. So all that needs to be brought on board, and you need to have a balance between the planning mechanism, which I think China has shown that it's very capable of using the planning mechanism, but also using markets, making sure that the emissions trading system really gets more powerful. I think it is already showing signs of becoming, from a kind of slow start, showing that it can become more powerful. We need to have also offset markets, very important, I think, to complement the current emission trading system. And then maybe most of all, we need to have the financial sector becoming more involved, and the leadership of the PBOC, but then pushing the different banks to look at their climate risk and look at the corporations that they have been funding and pushing that risk. And maybe as the final thing, since China is so important for global value chains, has become more and more important over time, over the last 15 years, it's so important that these lead firms that are controlling these value chains, they have the power and the incentives to decarbonize, and that's going to be possibly the most important single mechanism for decarbonizing and reducing the carbon footprint, and that China has a tremendous role to play. So I'm very optimistic that China will play a role, and also I think it's very encouraging because this is an area where I think there is still room for international cooperation, and where I think we have an agreement, in the US, in Europe, in China, how to measure climate change, how to, what are the critical levels of temperature, what are the tipping points we need to look for, and so on. All that is, very important when you try to cooperate, that you agree on those things. So that I think is something positive. And then we can go back to, trust and verify. This is the way for us to build trust, and we can verify what we do, and then we can build more trust. And maybe from that basis, we can build out to maybe other areas. Climate change is a very broad platform. As I said, it touches every part of society, every part of the economy. Let's try to build from that.
How do you think about the future of green transition in China?
Well, as I said, I think there is very strong commitment, and I think what we have seen from this summer and also, by the way, from last summer and so on, there have been, I think enough evidence that climate change is not something that is happening everywhere else, or it's affecting China very much, and the fact that China is the largest emitter means that China needs to act, and as I said, I think there is genuine commitment, and we should all help China in this, and this, everyone's contribution matters, and we should always remember that, and so I'm confident that China will get there. It will not be easy, but it will get there.
What lessons can other developing countries learn from China?
Well, I think that this is first, China is in it already, very diverse. It has many different parts with different levels of income and different economic structures. So just understanding these differences within China and how you need to approach them differently, and different. Some parts of the country have rich access to hydropower. Other parts of the country has abundance of coal, and other parts of the country are very urbanized and so on. So you have all those differences, and that already is a rich sort of laboratory to learn from. But I think what is what China has, and I think is going to be very important to try to build on in other countries is state capacity. It's a capacity to manage very complex projects, and so I think that's you have to look at the capacity at different levels of government. What's interesting in China is that when you looked at what does different provinces and different cities do and so on, I think the government has taken into account what is the capacity of that province or that government to do a particular project, and they try to take that into account when the extent to which the central government gets involved. I think that's one important lesson, that maybe in some countries you have to build up a strong center with skills, for example, a unit to specialized in public-private partnerships and so on, and then build from there, and then try to build skills locally in the individual regions of the country. So I think that's an important lesson so that China can teach other countries. I also think that China, was early in testing different things, experimenting with emission trading system, experimenting with offsets and so on. Maybe not always very successful, but they always learn, and I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that maybe sometimes you need to be willing to test things, and of course China has the advantage of its so vastness and the differences across the country, so that it can allow itself to test things out. But I think that is also important, that we and of course when you experiment, part of that is also about learning and innovating, and innovation is going to be absolutely key. International Energy Agency says that about 1/3 of the net zero transition is about innovation, and it's about some existing technologies that are not yet scalable, and there are some other technologies that are not yet even in the market, and how do we get these technologies to emerging and developing countries? And here I think China can both teach some lessons how you can cleverly adapt and imitate, and then eventually become an innovator, a genuine innovator too, but also maybe can be part of helping to transfer these technologies to developed countries. And I think they have shown that in some of these infrastructure investments that China has supported. So I think there are many possible lessons that China can teach, and there will be more as China really gets, and all parts of China gets deeply involved in the net zero transformation.
All right, thank you, Erik. Bye. Clearly, green transition should be a main trend for all countries, and to solve climate change, we need more cooperation across the world. That's all for today's show. See you.